Perfect. Office hour 16, Brendan. We're back. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Pretty fire? Good coffee?
Great coffee. It's at that perfect temperature right now where it's like I can really just
You want to tell the people about what you told me with your breakthrough finding of Starbucks cups and hot coffee?
Oh, it's just a world of difference to drink it without the lid on. I mean, your temperature regulation suffers, so you got to be ready to drink fast. Once it hits that right sweet spot, you probably got like, I would say, depending on external temperatures, you have about an hour.
Oh,
but damn, like if you can kill it,
I think people would highly disagree with that time length.
I mean, I've been going lid off. I mean, there's a 10-degree window, I would say, roughly.
Some people like that 1 degree window.
I mean, there's psychopaths out there for sure.
Beggars can't be choosers.
That's right.
So, who is our
Andrew Reiner, author of Better Boys, Better Men. Unbelievable conversation. We talked about so much in a way that does not get nearly enough attention. I'm a big fan of root cause analysis. And I think that's what he's getting at here.
Right.
And I think that that's super important because it takes out a lot of like individual blaming and guilt and a lot of that other stuff. And it helps people find reason in maybe why they're a certain way or why people they know are a certain way. And it is empowering to get them towards solutions. I think it's a good thing. So,
yeah. So just to recap, he's a professor at Towson University. He teaches English. And this book that he recently wrote, Better Boys, Better Men, is all about changing the way we think about masculinity. And man, like you said, I think this was such an important topic. I think, so just jumping right into it, I just always reflect back on kind of like how men have been in my life, and then also more recently with like the clinical work that I do. Whenever there's like a boy or a man presenting with symptoms, there's almost always anger involved. Like anger is pretty much highlighted in there. And then with my like coworkers, everybody understands that like underneath this anger is depression or sadness or something like that. But still, like these behaviors are existing significantly in families, and it's really disruptive. And I think that has been like one of my main takeaways is that, like he said in the book, there's this static and dynamic definition of masculinity, and we're very set on the static in our culture of like, you need to be this way. Men have to be brave. They have to have this call to action. They have to have every right answer. You can't appear like you're a failure, or maybe you're just curious about stuff, because you need to know what you're doing. And then there's just no emotional like flexibility that you're supposed to be able to have. It's like you're supposed to be stoic, which has its benefits, but at the same time, we don't want to neglect things that are coming up for us. And so there's this like one socially acceptable emotion that's pretty much anger, because it is perceived as being like tough or strong, and then everything else kind of gets pushed away. And this has several deep problems. Before I get into that, what are some of your thoughts that are coming up?
I'm just thinking like you made the correlation to like stoicism as maybe an ideal that we should strive for as men that's like throughout society. And I would say like, I actually even think it is, but what is like sorely neglected is an understanding of what it means to get to a place where you've achieved that. You know, it's not just do the action that a stoic would do, right? It's believe the philosophy, because there's, if I were to draw a comparison between like, you know, let's just say like, you know, there's a common, Ryan Holiday, who's a author about a lot of the Stoic philosophy stuff, talks about a story about Thomas Edison when he was inventing the light bulb. He had this giant factory and it caught fire and it was burning to the ground. Like everything he had worked for was right in front of him, and he was with his kids in the car and they were on the outside of the factory, and his factory, his life essentially was burning to the ground. And he turns to his kids and says, "Go get your mother. She's never going to see a fire like this again in her life." As in, and like, so that's this good story to show like what somebody who's a Stoic would do. And he went on to like build a better and bigger factory and became more wealthy and famous from it. So it's like looking at that negative thing as an opportunity. But what we don't talk about is that somebody can have a very similar reaction where they don't say anything, they're quiet, and they bottle it up. But that is not the same thing.
Yeah.
So we get caught up in this ideal of trying to strive for doing what maybe that like ideal masculine identity, like kind of like try and personify that ourselves without doing the prerequisite emotional bolstering to be able to handle acting in that way in the negative situation. And I think that that's just like, that's where this book is starting to build on top of like, how does somebody get started and where are we not getting our kids started in establishing that emotional resilience to be in front of extreme tragedy or whatever and still have a, you know, quote unquote, like strong masculine response.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's just like a very under talked about. We didn't even talk about it in the conversation because I didn't really make the Stoicism connection until you said that. But man, like if you haven't done the work on yourself to really understand how big picture this is not important, you still have everything in your life going for you. You still have to try and embody the masculine ideal, I'll call it, is an impossibility. Because you will, like you're saying, start manifesting all of these emotions as anger, like you're saying that you see in your clinical work. And then that is just so non-productive towards like starting to culminate the foundation of emotional stability that is necessary to be the masculine ideal, I guess.
No, yeah, you just hit on such a good point that I don't think I've fully put into perspective too, is that we have this idea of like what is ideal for being like Stoic, of understanding your emotions, understanding what's coming up for you, and then being able to move forward. But we kind of almost put that idea or that ideal on like a child or a teen and expect them to know what the hell to do in that situation and say like, it's fine, just move on, instead of saying like, hey, this was probably really tough. There's probably a ton of emotions that are coming up for you right now. Like, let's talk about that. And then also see if we can see this as an opportunity to move forward. We like skip that whole piece. Yeah. And then it's, as people progress, they get so confused and it manifests in one way that is probably not very good. And boom. Yeah. It's pervasive, man. So this is what's been coming up for me in like my clinical work too, as I really start to understand like what these things mean in our society. So like different diagnoses can be very stigmatizing and they can be seen in a very bad light. And so it's really important to consider like what type of diagnosis you want to diagnose somebody with, especially a child, because it's going to carry on with them throughout their lives. So for example, like oppositional defiant disorder, like conduct disorder, it's mainly around a lot of behavioral outbursts. And this diagnosis is seen as like, oh, this kid's a problem. Like they're going to be like outwardly behave terribly. And this diagnosis sometimes gets put on like 4 or 5-year-old kids, 6-year-old kids, who have probably only seen their parents experience, or their fathers specifically, present with anger, present with violence, and it's a learned behavior. So now they're acting these behaviors out as they're super dysregulated, and they have like complex trauma histories, and then they don't get the intervention or care that they maybe need. They become teens, and these behaviors get even more extreme maybe. And then there's like the whole school to prison pipeline. So the school system views them differently. Juvenile systems view them differently. And then as they become adults, like these things become criminal. And then that becomes, it's like this cycle of, I mean, everybody talks about the school to prison pipeline, and that is so real because these things are encouraged like in our society. Like if they're expressing with anger, it's somewhat reinforced. And if it's not reinforced in one way, it's going to be reinforced in another way by like schools seeing this kid as this way, or employees seeing as this person this way, or different types of things like this. And it's just crazy because I think it's a heavy topic, but it's been a good thing for me to really think about, because as a clinician, it's really important to like reflect on what kind of impact we have on people's lives. And I mean, in general, like, yeah, so just this diagnosis piece has been really hitting home for me ever since this conversation.
Yeah, what's the like standard procedure for like, let's say I'm going to like run you through a hypothetical, and I want you to tell me in your clinical setting, like what the following actions would be. Okay. So you have a child who comes in, who's brought in by their parents. Let's say they're 5, maybe like 5, let's say 5 to 7, just so there's like, we're in that range where like, you know, a little more attentiveness and maturity is starting to like they're growing out of like the really testing socially, like a 2 through 4 year old would really be doing, and like trying to integrate socially and not understanding and like testing those waters. So they're kind of starting to figure out the social piece of like how to behave, even if they don't do it perfect. And they're acting out in school, and it's like been becoming problematic, like where there's been some like physical outbursts, let's say. And they come to you, and you're like doing an initial like I don't know the process, but like you're initially screening this individual and like trying to understand their situation. Where, like, what are the steps from somebody like that comes into the office to they leave that day and there's like a treatment plan laid out for them? Like what does that process look like?
So it'll look different depending on the site.
Okay.
There'll be typically like,
so give me a hypothetical site, not necessarily even one from your personal experience, just like, you know. Yeah.
You'll go over consent forms, obtain consent by whoever the caregiver is, or whoever the necessary person is. And then you'll just start an intake process. Typically you'll start it with the caregiver or whoever has custody of the child. And then depending on the treatment model too,
how's the treatment model determined?
Also somewhat by the site or by the clinician.
Okay.
So I'm still a trainee, so this is still stuff that's new to me. I'm still learning, but I know that like in some specific treatment models, like child-parent psychotherapy, which they really want to focus on the relationship between the child and the caregiver, they will have like a lot longer intake process, to where there are certain steps of gathering this information from caregiver, asking them certain assessment questions, potentially talking to other collateral contacts, maybe like a teacher or something, but then also assessing like how they interact in a room. So they'll just have them play in a room, and you'll watch through like a two-way mirror, things like that. So yeah,
and then at what point in that process does diagnosis come in?
So depends on the site as well. If you have Medi-Cal, then diagnosis at the outset sometimes. So you have like an intake process, maybe it's like a 2-hour meeting. diagnosed by the end of that, create a treatment plan.
See, this is interesting to me. This is very interesting to me.
And that's for billing purposes, because in order to start billing for services, Medi-Cal requires a diagnosis.
Right.
Which is, it's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation about like the, medical industrial complex that we don't need to get into. But the reason I even started asking these questions, because it goes right back to what you were saying. Like the minute you get diagnosed, that is with you for life. If you get a severe, and granted, like not necessarily with you for life as in like other people are going to know. The minute I tell you, Nick, Bob, that you are something, you are now believing that you are something.
Yeah. No,
and there's a psychological impact of being told that you're something and that you like. So I guess my main question, and the reason I was going down this like series of questions, was like, where is there there should be a very, very serious tone behind a diagnosis. And it feels, again, from the outsider, I'm nowhere near as close to this business as you are, but just like understanding the issues and the problems that are out there, it feels like we'll just go ahead and diagnose everything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I could, like if somebody sat in a room with me, they could diagnose me with something,
Oh yeah. If you say like you're worried about something, then.
Oh, you must have anxiety.
Yeah.
Right. So like, why are we in this diagnostic game? Like it's like, it's not, man, I wonder if this person has a diagnosis. It's like, I wonder which diagnosis they have. And that's like a really scary mindset, especially when we start looking at how, and I'm not saying that diagnoses are unjustified. You know what I mean? Like they're absolutely, like the process is needed, but like I would compare it to any other major issue where if we over identify with a specific problem, we dilute the legitimacy of the people who are really suffering from the problem.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the whole issue with all of this, because it becomes like these labels become a part of people's identities. And it's not just that like people take that on themselves, but it's how other people push that onto them.
Yeah.
Like if you say, oh, you struggle with depression, then it's like, oh, I'm a depressed person.
Right.
And that's not the reality. It's like you're struggling with this at this time.
Yeah. Like I heard a comparison recently that like there's people who will diagnoses of end of life depression when given a terminal diagnosis. And it's like, because I think there's like two very different, and again, correct me where I'm wrong here, but there's like two very different types of depression. There's like a very clinical type of depression where like you like very different, seems to be unknown and unknowable, the causes of this depression. And it just comes over you and it is like very anxiety driven, or like it comes with a lot of anxiety. And then there's like this, you've just got some shitty news and you're sad, that we want to also call depression. And I'm like, I don't know that, like, sure, there's some legitimacy to calling that depression, but there's also some very clear drivers to why that would be not depression.
Right.
Like you can get shitty news, be sad, and not be a depressed person.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like that, it's those types of distinctions that are not made enough.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a huge problem when we start lumping all of these people together. And again, when we go back to this idea of like raising boys and raising men and like just like having the youth of society in general, we are like, again, a non-professional opinion, this is just a statement. I feel that we are over diagnosing and over categorizing everybody to the point that even people who are legitimately, let's say, diagnosed as depressed don't feel that that diagnosis is really worth, like, doesn't tell them anything about themselves because everybody's that way.
Right.
And it, in my opinion, can be extremely counterproductive to actually helping somebody who's really experiencing the true clinical signs of these issues. It prevents them from getting better because they feel like, well, like everybody's this way and we don't get better from it. So like, this is just the state of my existence now. And it's that type of like over-diagnostic and altered mindset that I feel like pushes a lot of young boys and men into like, I am just an aggressive, outbursting kind of a person. This is who I am. This is who I'm always going to be, rather than like legitimizing, again, maybe just like the traumatic end of life stuff. What if we're just like, maybe it's just like opening up the lines of communication so that they can understand their emotions, and then the diagnosis goes away. And like, maybe it's not something so deeply rooted in like their psyche, and it's just them not able to navigate their environment and their emotions.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just like, and again, I don't know what I'm talking about here, but it feels very troubling that like after our conversation, I feel like that is kind of what we were getting into a little bit.
Yeah.
Is like that when young men don't understand how to deal with it, is going to manifest this way. I see young boys acting out, and I'm like, and I see like, you know, I don't obviously know the nitty gritty behind everybody's life story and what goes on in the home life, but like, of course there's so many young men acting out. Like, this is an incredibly like chaotic and stressful time. And if young men aren't understanding how to manage this, there's infinite number of daily stresses that all people can experience in a day. It's like, it's innumerable how many things that we could choose to be anxiety ridden over. And if they're not given the framework to understand how to let certain things go and deal with certain things, and then the things that they do deem worthy of dealing with, how to address those things, like, of course they're going to be there's going to be outbursts, and there's going to be emotional anger. Like, and I feel like we put such a crazy expectation on the children without taking accountability for what is the adult's role in making sure that that child is set up to go out into the world to be a functioning part of society. Right. That is the job of a parent. Yeah. Is to make sure that their children can go out and socially acclimate without them present. You know, in a lot of ways, that's like literally the only goal of a parent. Yeah. And if people aren't if people are going into the parenting phases of their life and they have not committed to making the necessary sacrifices to manifest the reality of their child getting the things that they need, then they are going to have the negative repercussions of child outbursts and negativity and aggression, especially when we talk about the young men. So there's my soapbox. Please take it away from there.
No, I think that you're making such a good point with these like larger terms, like what the hell is masculinity, and then what the hell is depression. Like, yes, we have maybe a clinical definition and some criteria that make it up, but what does that mean for that person? Like, what are some of the things that are causing that person this feeling? And as we like just label people with these types of things, everybody feels like, oh, this must be what it is. But if we don't ask like how this actually shows up for that person in their specific life, then we don't see it as an umbrella term. We see it as the thing, when there's probably all these other things underneath that are underlying what is actually going on. And if we don't provide people with the language to name what's coming up for them, then it's going to feel so confusing, and it's going to be really hard for people in their body and mind to understand, like, how am I supposed to navigate what's coming up for me? Like, if I'm angry and I just say, oh, I'm angry, like I'm an angry person, well, that doesn't do anything for me.
And you're going to hold on to that anger.
Yeah.
Because you're going to start to identify with it.
Right.
Yeah.
But if I can understand, like, maybe I'm really frustrated or stressed or sad, maybe I'm bored, I don't know, something. Like, if I can't understand that, then there's going to be no healthy resolution to what's coming up for me. Yeah. And it's, this is just, again, I think that's why I really enjoyed this book and like this conversation, is because, like we're saying, this stuff gets talked about, like the thing of toxic masculinity gets talked about and thrown out there, but these underlying messages and roots do not get addressed. Like
Right.
it's just saying like this is bad. Like it needs to change. And it's like, okay, then how the hell am I supposed to change?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, figure it out.
I think I mentioned this to you earlier, but it's like it's the idea of rights versus responsibilities.
Yeah.
The mainstream conversation around masculinity circles around like how a toxically masculine personality steps on the rights of other people. And I think that what the real conversation needs to be about is personal responsibility as men and as people in relationships with men to hold people accountable to doing their part to ensure that no piece of their masculinity is overbearing for, you know, the group that they're in, and that they're not stepping on other people's toes, and whatever that looks like in their life. You know, it's personal responsibility. Like, you know, and this kind of reminds me of the conversation we had a while back about like the president. You know what I mean? We were talking about Donald Trump, and like everybody gets so triggered by the presidential and the Donald Trump conversations. And I think this is like maybe a better way of defining like where I come from on the whole presidential thing. It's like, I'm just like, great. Whoever the president is like has nothing to do with me. Like, because the actions I'm going to take are going to be grounded in me taking responsibility for myself, not what is Donald Trump doing to me, or what is Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whatever, like the local government during the like shutdowns, like what are they doing to me? It's like does it suck? And sometimes are there oversteps of power? 100%. Like no, there's no denying that. But at the end of the day, the only thing that I can have 100% control over changing the outcome of is the next decision that I make. And yeah, I feel like if more people took that, like, what can I do to better my own situation? You know, collectively, we have to like have an undertone of like social reform. I think that's a true thing. But on an individual level, we all also have to take accountability for the things that we do and our own, and we have to have personal responsibility. It's like, it's like such a funny little thing. But I remember having a conversation, I think it was with my parents, and I was like, we were just talking about like how crazy things had gotten. And one of my comments that, or like something that a comment somebody made that we were all just kind of laughing about is like, if you can't take your shopping cart in the grocery store and put it in the place where it's supposed to be, and you just ramp it up on the curb, don't talk to me about social justice, because you're not doing your part.
Oh man.
You know what I mean? Like, because you're triggering somebody else who's about to come in and park there. The butterfly effect is happening every negative decision that you make. You know what I mean? So if you're just going to pop your thing up on the curb in the middle of the parking lot, you're not contributing to the solution. And people need to think of it as that small of actions are what is necessary to make the greatest level of change. And I think that's the way we need to do it with the masculinity conversation.
Yeah, I do, because those little things add up. I go back to that point that he made in this book of, so he had these different conversations with teachers, and he noticed this in like some focus groups that he did with groups of like teen boys, that there was this like lack of questions in the classroom from boys and young men. And like when I read that, I was like, what? Like, what the hell is that? And then he goes on to say that like there can't be this openness to appearing like you don't know what the answer is. Like that you need to know the answer to this question, because you need to just always be right. And I was like, oh damn, like that really can be damaging if that's actually what a lot of boys are feeling. And I think to a certain extent I did feel that somewhat. I didn't know what it was, but excuse me. But that's so terrible for like just progressing forward and learning. If like you can't feel comfortable to ask a question, then how does that show up? And I told you this too. I'm so curious about how this shows up on like more important topics and exam, like more important exams or something, to where maybe you have a question, and if you ask that question, something great will happen and you'll learn from it. But if you don't, then you just step away from that situation in the same exact place that you were at, you know? And I think I'm glad that I know that you've always been open to questions, but that I've come to this point too, to where like being curious and vulnerable is completely the right way to go about things, because you don't know stuff.
Yeah.
Like,
dude, like, I know this is like such an interesting, like I'm just making all kinds of correlations in my head right now, because one of the things, I'm going to try and keep this like pretty succinct, but like the idea that you were just posing, right? Of like the negative aspect of not allowing questions and curiosity to be pursued. It was like this really weird, I've been listening, for our listeners, like the few of you who would go out and like look this up, I've been listening to this series on YouTube done by Jordan Peterson, where he's like digging into basically making a case for the psychological basis of living, essentially, that is present in the Bible. And it's pretty interesting. And one of the things he talks about is this idea of having like an aim and trajectory in your life, and like shooting for something. And that like, in a lot of sense, being curious and going towards new information is not only a great way of like learning and growing as a person, but it's actually like a necessity for like purpose and development and like feeling whole in your life, is like moving. And he like used the correlation of the word information. Like we use the word information all the time, but like when you think of it from a psychological perspective of like the growth that comes from, you know, curiosity and inquiry and things of that nature, and asking questions. And then you split up the two words and you look at it, and it's in formation, and you think of it as like such a growth word. Like the word comes with so much additional meaning of growth. Like information is growth. And I think, like, to the point you're making, like we are drastically limiting the growth potential of so much of our youth by not giving them a space where they can feel comfortable enough to ask questions.
Yeah. And this is just the classroom setting in general, almost like with the idea of lecture-based classes as opposed to discussion-based.
Yeah.
Like if you're just being thrown all this information without a chance to kind of reflect back, like what's coming up for you, like, are you really learning? I don't know. Maybe,
are you growing?
Yeah.
Are you becoming a better person?
Right.
Like on a much deeper level than like learning. Like learning's great, but I think it's a byproduct of trying to grow too, you know? And like if we're not giving people the space, like, yeah, I think all 4 years of high school in reality should have a
seminar,
a discussion-based class, a small discussion-based class where you, like, your participation is dependent on your grade, or your grade is dependent on your participation.
Yeah.
Because you, as unfortunate as it is, I know some people get a lot of anxiety about sharing, but like, you know, to go into that obstacle is the way type of a stoic mindset, like you've got to share, you've got to contribute.
And where does that come from too, right? Like, why do people have anxiety about sharing? It's probably
because they feel stupid and wrong, like you're saying.
And it's not encouraged enough.
Yeah.
Jesus.
The answers are right there, man.
Dude, but for real, right? Like, I think about the education system in my experience, and extremely grateful for the education I've had and continue to have. But if, like, I was just like zombieing through each day of like, go to this class, learn this, and I never critically thought about anything.
For real.
Like maybe like two things that came up once a year.
Your critical thinking came from like creativity through sports, right?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's how a lot of young people like express their creativity and critical thinking skills. But like, yeah, it's just such a weird thing. Like you go through so many years of schooling to like not really feel like you've critically thought about much at all. And I feel like that's an uncomfortably common sentiment.
It is. Yeah. And I think that's the huge benefit that we have doing office hours specifically, because we could have that conversation with a professor, leave it at that, and go on with our lives. But if we don't take this time to actually like process and talk about what that conversation was like, and like 2 weeks or a week later, like what are the effects still, then like it might have such a lesser impact.
Yeah. I mean, half of the way I'm continuing to learn for myself is by saying these things out loud and trying to process them out loud as we're having these conversations. You know, as much as I'm like trying to synthesize to like further the conversation, I'm also synthesizing to battle test my own thoughts to see if they sound stupid or not, you know?
Yeah.
And like putting them out there so that you can challenge them or rethink them in your own way. Because if you think of something that I haven't thought of, then I want to hear that.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an interesting dilemma the youth of our nation see themselves in.
It is. This, I've been...
Do you think speech and debate as a like a club in high school should be like a real class?
Yeah, I wonder if we can call it something else. So I feel like the term speech and debate is very politicized now, and it's like,
it's like for the people who want to be lawyers and politicians,
right?
Yeah.
And so no one really wants to touch that unless you're really wanting to get into that. It should be called like, I don't know. We're gonna have to come up with a name. If you guys have a name,
verbal discussion.
Yeah, something.
Speech and debate, verbal discussion. I mean,
talk with your friends.
Chitty chatty.
Yeah. Something that's like, just like, hey, you're going to talk about stuff and it's going to be really cool.
Yeah.
Those have been my favorite classes. I took this class at DVC. Well, I took 2 of the classes with the professor because I love them. They were psych courses, and she taught about theory, but every class she would open up with some question about like, what are relationships supposed to look like? And just kind of almost left it at that. And then students would chime in. She would play like the opposing role at times and like offer like, well, what about this side? And then somebody else would say something else. And God, I was so engaged and so enthralled in that class every time because I was learning from my peers, learning from the professor, rethinking my opinion. And it was just fantastic.
Yeah. It's so funny to think about too. Like, I just remember as like a young person, one thing I would regularly do, and like, I definitely had no clue. Like, I could not have put the words I'm about to put to it at the time. But like, I had a buddy who I would regularly like just call out for being wrong on things that, and I would take the opposite stance, and I had no insight or intellectual reason to have thought that my side was right. But like, thinking back to what I got out of that is I made him articulate his point until I had no choice but to believe it. And a lot, like 99% of the time I was wrong. Like I would be like if he just tried to make a point, it was like, this is like how I would explain it now. If somebody tried to make a point but did not really back it up, and you were like, okay, maybe, but like, give me more than that, because that sounds pathetic. Yeah. Like, I'm not just going to believe that. Then I would take the opposite stance to like bait him into like really giving me a thorough explanation. And I have no clue why I was doing that. Like, I feel like I told myself like, man, I'm just being an asshole. I'm like being difficult for no reason.
It was definitely just funny.
But it was funny to like hear, but like in a way there was like a ton of utility in like that taking the, you know, the lesser known side and just being like debunk it, like show me where it's wrong. And then like, I probably processed a lot of stuff that way, like gaining a better understanding of, even if I agreed with the point that they were trying to make for the most part, I was like, yeah, but there's this whole other side that you're not even considering. By taking that side, then they've considered it. And if they can still back up their side, it just like changes the the dynamic. So like, it's funny to think about, like with the whole speech and debate thing and like having conversations and like the classes that you're talking about. There's so much to be learned even by like taking the side you don't believe in.
Yeah.
You know,
And just
and trying to
it.
get that perspective, like not take the idea as in just like be like defensive over it for no reason, but trying to come to a conclusion of like, why does somebody truly feel like this is the best thing, you know, and then being like, and then gaining an understanding. And then you can be like, and that's how you like engage in like civil discourse, right?
Right.
It's like by really not by hearing what somebody says. You have to do more than that. You have to really put yourself in the position of that person and be like, why does this person think this way?
Yeah.
And then you can start to unpack and be like, okay, maybe there's some situations where that is the best thing.
Yeah.
You know?
And maybe they can start to understand why I'm on this side now too, if I can somewhat see where they're coming from. Yeah. I've been like slaying Naval Ravikant's podcast, the Naval podcast, and it's really so interesting because he is like so succinct in the way he talks, and it's just like knowledge bomb. And I think this was him. It might have been somebody else, but he talked about how there was a tweet that got put out. I'm pretty sure he tweeted it. And it said, a smart person is a slow reader. And he said that a lot of people took it like, oh, I read slow, so I must be smart. And he's talked about this too. I've heard in other podcasts of like,
wait, which is so funny that people would think, again, a smart person is a slow reader. Somebody would think so quickly that they are a slow reader, so they must be smart. That's the point of the statement.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's talked about this before of like, instead of reading 100 books a year, I'd rather read one page, thoroughly think about it, reflect on what my thoughts are, really grasp that concept, and then move forward. And so this idea of thinking about ideas, reflecting on them, trying to like fully understand them rather than just memorize does so much for our knowledge. Like people who can read slow understand the concepts that they're actually reading instead of just being like, oh yeah, I'll take that snippet. Wealth of value.
Yeah. Well, it's such a fascinating thing to think about too, where like in a lot of ways, the reading itself has zero utility from a growth perspective, aside from the way that it contributes to your ability to process things in a new way. You know?
Yeah.
Because if you were reading something that you didn't think about, didn't process in a new way, then it was useless. But if you think about, if you're reading new ideas, that gives you then the potential to think and process in a new way. That's where the utility is. It's in breaking things down and thinking about things in a new way. It's not about the reading itself.
Yeah.
It's about the presentation of ideas.
It's like the same thing with like making money almost. Like you can make a ton of money, but if you're not doing the right things with it and not applying it to your life in the right way, and not like maybe understanding that it's not the only thing, then it's just going to be pointless.
Yeah.
Like if you're reading all this information and not understanding it or applying it, the information that is helpful, then it's just taking notes.
Yep.
I mean, that's what I did all throughout my education. This is another thing. Last thing for me. I remember in my history class in like grade school, there was such an emphasis on take good notes. And there was like a specific structure of how I was supposed to take notes. And it's like write everything down that's pretty much in the paragraph and then never look at the notes again pretty much. And it was the stupidest thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
Like they had me take notes on like 40 pages of a chapter that I was too stressed to read and understand because I was trying to take notes on this thing.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to like look back and think like, okay, if you had stopped taking notes and really paid attention in history, like really were paying attention, or at least to the degree that you had the attention that you were putting on your notes on the discussion, right? So that it was still like an even score. And then somebody took you for like an hour once a week to really just like have the same conversation again about all of the key points that you learned, you'd probably have absorbed way more history.
A ton more. I would have probably narrowed down like a couple topics that I was super interested in it and been able to riff on that for so long.
Yeah, there's a reason why a lot of like stories throughout history that have been like traditionally, you know, relegated to spoken word and all of that. Like there's a reason why humans are uniquely able to like speak.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it's a natural human ability, and I feel like we underestimate the utility of like spreading ideas through our words,
mm-hmm.
and formulating ideas through our words.
Yeah, and this is why mind mapping has changed the way I learn information. Like instead of taking notes on every little thing, when I just take, let's say it's like a TED Talk on emotional awareness, and they talk about like one huge topic that umbrellas into all these other topics. If I just write that one big word and then maybe like some other keywords about those little points, I'm going to remember everything. But if I'm writing every goddamn specific note, I'm not remembering anything.
Right.
And then when I look back to it, it doesn't impact me the same way.
Yeah. Which in a way is you giving yourself just enough information to continue to have to go back, look at those few words, and then it demands you critically think again about how are these things all related.
Yes.
And that is in a way you requiring you put some thought and processing into remembering and synthesizing what you just heard.
Right. And there was a reason why I wrote down just that one word.
Yeah.
And I can draw
because you
back
knew
on
it would
that.
be like a good trigger.
Yeah. Whew.
Man,
This is a good one, Brendan.
this is. We got deep on this.
Yeah.
We went all over the place.
Fire. Fire. So better boys, better men. If you're interested in kind of what we've talked about, if you like the conversation, highly recommend this book. Don't have to agree with everything that's in it. Definitely up for your interpretation. But I think it's a really cool way to just start a really good conversation about a lot of things that are coming up. And I'm sure in some way you've experienced this or you see it in our society, in our American culture.
Absolutely.
All right, Brennan, do you know who? No, we'll leave this one up for the audience. We're not going to expose who.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned, everybody.
We'll be back.
Hope you have a good time. If you're driving, stay safe. If you're running, run faster. Anything else, Brennan?
If you're sitting, stand
Sit
up.
harder. Oh. All right, good night, everyone.